afternoon, all. And by way of introduction, I'm Judy Farmer, Financial Institution Compliance Principal with Eide Bailly. I've spent the past 25 years working with financial institutions to provide much needed services, including internal audit, quality control, federal and state compliance, fair lending, loan reviews, and Sarbanes-Oxley and FDIC compliance requirements, and of course any other needed services that the institution would require.
I am Scott Smalago. I'm an FI compliance manager with Eide Bailly. My focus is internal audit of financial institutions and other organizations. I also do banking compliance and other assurance engagements, including nonprofits and manufacturing.
Hi, I'm Patrick Schneider. I'm a risk advisory manager here in our Twin Cities office. I've spent the last 8 or 9 years in internal audit out in the corporate world, and for the last year and a half I've been back with the firm. I spend most of my time performing internal audits around risk management and risk management areas, while also performing a decent amount of audits for financial institution clients.
All right, so let's begin. Today, we're going to have a review of the IIA overview. And so we want to discuss in the benefits of the quality assurance review, but in order to understand that purpose, let's first look at the internal audit function and how the two come together. The Institute of Internal Auditors, or the IIA, was established in 1941 and is an international professional association that's headquartered in Florida. The IIA is an internal audit professions recognized authority worldwide, providing educational and development opportunities for all of its members. As the recognized authority, the IIA promotes knowledge of internal audit and its role in control, risk management, and the government's processes. It provides leadership and support of the IIA mission, and it advocates and promotes internal audit professionals to add value to any organization. And the mission of internal audit is to enhance and protect organizational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice, and insight. As noted, the definition, how do we define internal audit? Internal auditing is an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organization's operations. It helps an organization accomplish its objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, controls, and governance processes. So the Institute promulgated the IPPF, which is the International Professional Practices Framework. It's a framework that organizes both mandatory and recommended guidance for the performance of internal audits. So first, let's take a look at the mandatory guidance, which includes the core principles and which define internal auditing and the standards for the profession and the code of ethics. We'll take a deeper look into the guidance. So when we look at the core principles, taken as a whole, they articulate the internal audit effectiveness. For an internal audit function to be considered effective, all principles should be present and operating effectively. Those include integrity, competency, independence, communication, and more, and all that are demonstrated in the process. How an internal auditor, as well as an internal audit activity, demonstrates achievement of the core principles may be quite different from organization to organization and from industry to industry. But failure to achieve any of the principles would imply that an internal audit activity was not as effective as it could be in achieving the internal audit's mission. So when we look at the code of ethics, as with any organization, the code of ethics is going to state the principles and expectations governing the behavior of individuals and organizations in the conduct of internal auditing. It describes the minimum requirements for conduct and behavioral expectations rather than specific activities. And the purpose of the institution's code of ethics is to promote an ethical culture in the profession of internal auditing. A code of ethics is necessary and appropriate for the profession of internal auditing as it is for most professions, founded as it is on the trust placed in its objective assurance about governance, risk management, and control. The Institute's Code of Ethics includes two essential components. First, the principles that are relevant to the profession, and then the rules of conduct that describe behavior norms expected of internal auditors. These rules are an aid to interpreting the principles into practical applications and are intended to guide the ethical conduct of internal auditors. So internal auditors refers to institution members, recipients of or candidates for IIA professional certifications, and for those who perform internal audit services within the definition of internal auditing. So the Code of Ethics applies to both entities and individuals that perform internal audit services. The fact that a particular conduct is not mentioned in the rules of conduct does not prevent it from being unacceptable or discreditable, and therefore the member, the certification holder, or candidate can be liable for disciplinary action under the IIA standards. So internal auditors are expected to apply and uphold the following principles. First, integrity that establishes trust and thus provides the basis for reliance on their judgment. They do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Next, they are to exhibit the highest level of professional objectivity in gathering, evaluating, and communicating information about the activity or the process being examined. Auditors are to make a balanced assessment of all of the relevant circumstances and are not unduly influenced by their own interests or by others in forming judgments. They are to respect the value and ownership of information received and to not disclose information without appropriate authority unless there is a legal or professional obligation to do so. And they are to apply the knowledge, skills, and experience needed in the performance of the internal audit services that they are to provide. In 2019, the IIA released new implementation guidance for the Code of Ethics. Internal auditors are often considered the conscience of their organization. To be viewed as trusted advisors, they must strive to be above reproach and to avoid ethical pitfalls. Each of the four Code of Ethics principles, integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, and competency, are accompanied by specific rules of conduct. Internal auditors need to know to implement each principle and rule of conduct and how to show conformance as part of a quality assurance and improvement program. It's important to know the rules as outlined in the Code of Ethics, and it is important to review these to understand the importance that the IIA places on each of the principles. So in looking at the rules of conduct, under integrity, an auditor shall perform their work with honesty and responsibility. They have to observe the laws of the state, the federal laws, the laws that govern the organization and the industry that they're auditing. They're not to knowingly be a party to any sort of illegal activity or engage in acts that discredit them from the profession. Obviously, they are to respect and contribute to the ethical objectives of the organization. Integrity and objectivity. Objectivity, they are not to accept anything that may impair or be presumed to impair their professional judgment. You can see they not disclose material facts known to them, as stated earlier, unless things come under a legal process. And then when we look at confidentiality, it's so important for all of us in the industries that we work in. Confidentiality in today's world is very critical. So an auditor must be prudent in the use and protection of information that they acquire in the course of the work that they perform. And they cannot use this information for any sort of personal gain or in any manner that would be contrary to the law or detrimental to the legitimate and ethical objectives of the organization. Confidentiality. And then, of course, competency. Your internal auditor needs to be knowledgeable, skillful, and have experience. They are performing under the standards of the Institute of Internal Auditors. and they're continually improving their proficiency. Continuing education is a requirement for certified auditors to ensure their proficiency. And then the international standards. Those are the principles that provide a framework for performing and promoting internal auditing. The mandatory requirements, as stated here, consist of statements of basic requirements for the profession, interpretations, which clarify terms or concepts within the statements, and then the standards, which employ terms that have been given specific meanings, which are in the glossary, which forms a part of the standards. So it's necessary to consider both the statements and their interpretations to understand and apply the standards correctly. The most recent revision made to the standards was effective January 1st of 2017. The structure of the standards is divided into attribute standards and performance standards. And the attribute standards address the characteristics of organizations and parties performing internal audit activities. The quality assurance review that we're here to talk about today falls under the attribute standards. The performance standards describe the nature of the internal audit activities, and they provide criteria against which the performance of these services can be evaluated. Performance standards may be set based on national, state, or scientific guidelines, benchmarking against similar organizations, the public, or leaders' expectations or other methods. And I know that Patrick and Scott will delve deeper into those when they go over the actual quality assurance review. We've come to our first polling question.
All right, our first polling question here. What code does the statement represent? The internal standards for the professional practice of internal auditing standards. So a little tricky there. The correct answer is actually professional practice code.
Hi, everyone. While Judy provided a background or overview of the framework and guidance that applies to the internal audit profession, I'll dive deeper into guidance specifically related to quality assurance reviews or external quality assessments, as I've referred to it in the slide deck. For the remainder of the presentation, these two terms can be used interchangeably. They're one and the same. I'll run through why these assessments are necessary. Before I jump into specific information related to external qualities reviews, I'd like to give you background information on quality assurance topic as it relates to internal auditing itself. One of the most critical aspects of any internal audit activity, whether it's an organization's own internal audit function or whether it's performed in more of a consulting role, is that it must have credibility with its stakeholders. To be considered credible, it's important for the internal audit functions to be professional, abiding by the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing. For the remainder of this webinar, just because it's kind of wordy, I'll be referring to them simply as the standards. As Judy had previously mentioned, together the standards and other key elements make up what is known as the IPPF. The IPPF organizes all authoritative guidance related to internal auditing. One of the primary mechanisms for determining if an internal audit function conforms with the standards is through what's called a Quality Assurance and Improvement Program, or a QAIP. Basically, a QAIP is an ongoing activity within an internal audit function designed to enhance the quality and value of all internal audit services performed. This includes consulting services in an internal audit shop may perform as well. It should also assess the efficiency and effectiveness of the services performed, as well as identify opportunities for continuous improvement within the audit process. The primary objective of a QAIP is to evaluate the audit activity's conformance with relevant policies, audit manuals or charters, operating procedures, the standards, core values, and the IA's Code of Ethics. Basically, this program should determine if the internal audit activity is aligned with the IA's definition of internal audit. Why is a QAIP necessary? Well, it should be noted that implementing a formalized QAIP is required by the standards. But fundamentally, in an internal audit shop should keep pace with evolving or growing organizations that they serve, whether it's due to economic, technological, or regulatory related changes that may affect an organization. Within a QAIP, there are two primary components, and this is pretty important here. An internal audit assessment, which I will be discussing first, and an external assessment that I'll dive into more detail later on in the presentation. this external assessment, this is what would be considered a quality assurance review or an external quality assessment. As it relates to internal assessments, which as the name sounds, is an internal audit shop's assessment of its own activities and practices, there are two primary elements: ongoing monitoring and periodic self-assessments. When I think of ongoing monitoring, I associate this with the engagement level managing or the supervision of an audit or audits. It's assessing how audit and consulting work is performed at the engagement level. This is an internal audit function reviewing its services or audits against the standards noted on your screen. Most of these are relatively self-explanatory. However, an example of monitoring progress would be the active monitoring and tracking of management's issue remediation progress. And that's just one example. As it relates to periodic self-assessments, this is a much more holistic and comprehensive review of an internal audit function. It looks as though we're on to our second polling question.
All right, polling question number 2. Internal Assessment Standard 1311 is key component of QAIP, true or false? And the second polling question is now open.
The answer is indeed true. Remember, it's the internal and external process that kind of makes up that QAIP. Bringing the conversation back to periodic self-assessments, self-assessments are performed to ensure that an internal audit function conforms with all of the standards, as well as the IA's Code of Ethics, with the overall objective of ensuring that an IA activity aligns with the IA's definition of internal audit. Self-assessment should evaluate the results of ongoing monitoring that we just spoke about last slide, the adequacy of internal audit policies, manuals, charters, operating procedures, etc., the various ways that the internal audit activity adds value to its stakeholders, the achievement or monitoring of key risk indicators, and the degree in which stakeholder expectations are met. One last thing to mention on self-assessments is that it is a best practice for an internal audit shop to perform this assessment at least annually. I previously worked for a mid-sized financial services organization here in the Twin Cities, where we had a smaller, what was called kind of a financial standards subcommittee built within the audit function. And our role was to, one, review a select number of audits each year to ensure conformance with the standards, and two, to aid in the overall assessment of our audit activity. It's truly grading the audit shop's conformance with the definition of internal auditing and highlights the impact of the audit shop's work on the organization service. Moving on to external assessments. What is an external quality assessment, or QAR? Again, these terms can be used interchangeably. In theory, this type of assessment is identical to that of an internal assessment that I just spoke about, other than it is performed by an independent validator or validation team. An external assessment determines that an organization's internal audit activity, again, conforms with all of the standards, the Code of Ethics, as well as the definition of internal auditing. For an internal audit activity to be able to state in an audit report that is conformance with the standards, it must have had an external assessment performed, and all audit shops are required to have an external assessment once every 5 years. This is a mandatory requirement stated in the standards. I've spoken to other colleagues and other folks around our industry and several of our clients where they in some cases can use this term loosely, where they say they performed a specific review in accordance with the IA standards. But unless you've had this external assessment performed, you cannot state that in any of your internal audit reports. So that's very critical to obtain that understanding. There are two approaches to performing an external quality assessment. The first approach is when an independent validator or validation team performs what's called a full external quality assessment. The team would perform all aspects of the engagement and report on their results. The IA's Quality Assessment Manual has all the assessment programs needed to perform this type of engagement. And when thinking of a full EQA, the validator or assessment team would complete all applicable programs and report on the results. The second approach to performing an external quality assessment is what's called a self-assessment with independent validation. As audit functions are required to perform their own internal assessments, which we previously discussed, the standards allow for an independent validator or team to review an internal audit function's own internal assessment. This will require the external team to substantiate some of the internal function's own work and will include interviews of the chief audit executive or director and other members of the team in larger audit shops. These interviews will most likely include members of upper management as well. As far as reporting goes for a self-assessment with an independent validation, the report is typically signed by both the chief audit executive as well as the independent validator or validation team lead. However, I have heard of different situations where there's maybe a disagreement in the final reporting results. If that situation were to arise, that independent validator would issue their separate report. And one common question I typically receive is whether a CPA firm could perform a QAR for a client in which they also perform the annual external audit. And through all the digging and research that I've done, there is no definitive answer. However, in the IA's guidance, it does note that this could lead to questions regarding potential conflicts of interest. Within the guidance, Standard 1312 explicitly states that a CAE or an audit director must discuss the qualifications and independence of the external reviewer, while also stating that the external reviewer must not have any real or apparent conflicts of interest. For me, the safe bet would be no. They cannot perform the external audit as well as the QAR, because in many cases, an external audit firm would rely on some of the work that internal audit does, especially for a larger organizations where control testing will be performed. So that typically wouldn't mesh well. This next slide outlines the general requirements for conducting an external quality assessment. So these are the requirements needed to actually perform the engagement. The external validator or members of the validation team must be certified audit professionals. They must have current knowledge of the internal audit profession as well as the client's industry. Generally, all members of the validation team will be at a managerial level. This assessment team lead will be a chief audit executive or have comparable internal audit management experience. Lastly, having prior experience working as a team member on an external quality assessment engagement or completing the IIA's quality assessment training course also serves as this experience requirement. In saying all this, it's really on an organization's chief audit executive or audit director to determine if the external assessment team has the required competence and experience to conduct the engagement. Also, it should be noted, every member of the assessment team doesn't need to have every requirement listed on the screen here. The team collectively as a whole needs to have these requirements. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's a good resource guide. Within the IA's website, they have a phenomenal frequently asked questions section, which completely summarizes everything that you need to know about the IA's quality assessment manual, as well as the services that need to be performed every 5 years. So if anyone has any additional questions they'd like to look at, again, this link is critical. Looks like we are on to our third polling question.
All right, third polling question here. CAE or comparable senior internal audit management experience can be considered general requirements for conducting an EQA. True or false?
So it looks like most of you guys answered true, which is the correct answer. Being a chief audit executive or any sort of senior managerial experience, it will suffice as it's actually one of the heavy requirements is that, you know, a professional has to be competent in order to perform these engagements. So having chief audit executive experience or comparable senior audit managerial experience will suffice as that kind of experience requirement. So next, Scott will be taking a deeper dive into the performance aspect of external quality assessments.
Thank you, both Judy and Patrick. So far we've covered the definition of internal auditing, the IPPF, the Code of Ethics, and the overview of the quality assessment for both internal and external. Today I'm going to be covering the QAR process, focusing on The full external assessment, due to the involved nature of that assessment, this is going to be more of a 10,000-foot level overview. So what can you expect as the chief audit executive in an internal audit department? First, it should be noted, this is actually going to require significant time commitment from you throughout the planning and fieldwork phases. It's the external assessment, in order to provide the most accurate assessment, relies on the active involvement of everybody, the CAE, the internal audit staff, the audit committee, executive leadership, and others as it's deemed necessary. Additionally, depending on the size and the structure of your organization, you as the CAE or internal audit management may be requested to assist us in scheduling of the various interviews, meetings, and other requests. What are some of the benefits of the external assessment? And I know Patrick touched on these as well. This process allows you to take a deeper look into how your department is functioning. What are some of your established best practices? Areas where you may not be in conformance with the standards, and where you could improve overall internal audit practices. An external assessment gives you that third-party view of the function's operations, interactions with your audit committee, and operating management as a whole. So you get that feedback from them as to their opinions of the work you're doing, whether you're reporting that information in a way they can understand. This process looks at how the function is performing when compared to the authority granted in your charter and what the organization, as far as the audit committee and executive leadership, is expecting of you. Determines an overall opinion as to your level of conformance with the standards and that code of ethics. This will take a look at the opportunities for improvement and the gaps to conformance, and will provide you recommendations to bring your internal audit function into conformance if there are gaps based on internal audit and industry best practices. Also, as Patrick noted, the assessment will aid in enhancing internal audit's credibility within the organization. It gives you an opportunity to let them know that you're listening. There are 5 main components to the external assessment, which we're going to cover more in depth. The planning, which this is the largest time commitment from you. There are surveys that are conducted, interviews, the assessment programs, and then, of course, the evaluation summary and the report. During the planning phase, we'll gather information from you surrounding the background of the internal audit function, asking, what's the maturity of the function? Are you a new department? Have you been established for a while and have sufficient policies and procedures? What are the certifications of your staff? What's the background of the organization? How many locations? Who are going to be our key contacts during this process? And we'll continue to use this information throughout our engagement. Examples of documentation that we're going to request from you. We're going to be looking at the internal audit and audit committee charters, your department policies and procedures, CPE records of your staff, the department's QAIP, and recent reports that you've provided to the audit committee regarding completed engagements, your audit plan, and your resource plan. There are actually 4 planning guides, and these follow the standards in order as far as attribute and performance standards. And these will provide the CAE's perspective surrounding the related conformance criteria of the standards. They allow you to self-identify successful audit practices. These may be noteworthy leading practices of that department, and you can identify the opportunities for improvement. These may be areas in which you, during that planning process, have determined some level of nonconformance may exist, or areas in which you feel the department could benefit from recommendations or best practices to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of your audit department. A quick overview of the guides. The governance guide relates to the governance of internal audit, independence and objectivity, and looking at the QAIP. The audit staff guide provides information surrounding the proficiency, the due care, and continuing professional development. The audit management guide deals with the nature of the work performed, overall opinions if they are issued, and that's not talking about ratings of findings or individual engagements, and any acceptances of risks. And finally, the audit process guide. It's going to cover your engagement planning, the performance of the individual engagements, communications, and monitoring of progress of noted findings and observations to the audit committee. Also, during our planning meetings with you, we're going to establish our list of survey participants, choose who we're going to interview, and the engagement work papers that we're going to look at. Typically, those are all going to be interconnected, especially who we're going to interview is going to be attached to who we're reviewing the work papers. We want to get their feedback on how that engagement went, any feedback that they may have or questions they may have had, disagreements. The surveys, they're going to be sent to the largest group of participants. This is going to include internal audit, executive leadership, and operating management. Any interviews will be performed with a subset of the survey participants. And our engagement selections will be focused on those assurance and consulting jobs performed within the most recent 12 to 18 month period. There are two surveys. There's one for the executive leadership and operating management of the company and the internal audit staff. These are completed using a sliding or a Likert scale through strongly agree or strongly disagree and open-ended questions. You as the CAE, we're going to expect you to participate in both, providing your assessment, and this is going to allow us to develop any contrasting views, which we can then follow up on during interviews. The executive leadership includes the audit committee chair, current and past, if applicable, the CEO, CFO, any others that may interact with the CAE or internal audit on a regular basis. Operating management, again, are those individuals where you have provided assurance or consulting engagements during the period under review. And then depending on the size of your audit department, we'll typically have the entire department complete that survey. This provides us just a complete picture of the department and its operations, its management. Just to give you an idea, the survey itself takes anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to take these surveyed responses. They provide us with information as to the management, the operations, and the perception of internal audit throughout the organization. We're going to summarize these responses, and we will actually discuss them with the CAE or internal audit management. However, the individual responses are going to remain confidential. The last thing we want is any blowback or anything coming up as an HR issue, of course. The team will analyze the responses for areas where there's divergence from the responses provided by the audit executive, any concerns that may arise, or any successful practices noted by those participants. And we'll incorporate those into our individual interviews where we can follow up on those, get further detail. They can provide us any other areas that maybe they didn't feel comfortable providing that information in a survey. These interviews typically are taking place face-to-face when it's possible. Again, it depends on the setup of your organization, the locations, the availability of those individuals. The number of interviews will vary. Again, depends on the number of jobs that you complete during the year. Number of individuals within the department. If you have a very large internal audit department, instead of doing individual face-to-face interviews, we may do a focus group. The actual audit committee and senior leadership interviews focus on providing their views of the value of the engagements performed, the professionalism of your staff, and the perceived areas of improvement. And the internal audit staffs are focused on the management of the department, the processes in place, and the professional development within the department. So are they getting enough CPE? What do they think of the review process? Things of that nature. Once we get into the assessment programs, these are where we take all the information we've started to gather from the planning guides, the survey responses, the interviews we've completed, and the information we've gathered from reviewing your engagements. And we focus on determining the compliance with the standards and the code of ethics. And we ask some of the questions: do the responses provided in the planning guides align with the information gathered through the survey responses and interviews? Is the governance in place for internal audit to meet those standards? Are the policies and procedures currently in place being followed and practiced by the department for all engagements? And is the work performed by internal audit in conformance with the standards? Based on this, we'll identify your successful audit practices in place, any gaps to conformance, and areas of opportunity. And we have reached our fourth polling question. Amy, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Sounds good. All right, we're at our fourth polling question here. For the surveys and interviews, what are the two surveys that the CAE will be expected to participate in? You can see your choices there.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of you got the answer correct. It is the executive leadership and operating management and internal audit staff. Those are the two surveys we're going to cover. We're going to send it out to the CFO, the CEO, the audit committee chairs, and those staff within your internal audit department. So now we're going to take a look at what that reporting process looks like once we've gone through all the previous steps. We're going to provide you a summary listing of each applicable standard and the code of ethics based on the following rating scale. And these are the standard Institute of Internal Auditors ratings. Generally conforms. Your internal audit is conforming in all material respects with the standard, although there may still be areas for you to improve. Partially conforms. The department is working in good faith of the standard, but some gaps do exist. And some of those deficiencies may be beyond the control of internal audit and require recommendations to the audit committee or executive leadership. Does not conform. We've most likely determined internal audit is either unaware of the standard or not working to comply. Examples of this may be you haven't developed a QAIP, you haven't performed an internal assessment, your independence is impaired either in appearance or in fact. Typically, there are going to be significant areas of improvement for internal audit and other areas. We're going to utilize these individual determinations to develop our overall opinion of the activity's conformance with the standards and code of ethics. In the report, we're going to provide you an overall opinion of your conformance with the standards and code of ethics. It should be noted An opinion of less than generally conforms for your internal audit activity as a whole will keep you from including the language stating that the work was performed in accordance with the standards. You know, as Patrick mentioned, some audit shops are still going to do it even though they haven't had a QAR. You know, there's nothing keeping you from doing it, although if somebody looks at it, you're not going to want to have that language. You could do an internal assessment later and determine that you have, in fact, remedied those areas of non-conformance. For any standards that are rated less than generally conform, we will provide you the details of that observation and recommendations for improvement. Your successful practices and strengths are going to be listed. We'll also list any opportunities for continuous improvement which are identified. These may be areas to improve the effectiveness or efficiency of the department, or suggestions based on industry best practices, some which may be unrelated to the conformance with standards or the code of ethics. I'm going to now turn it back over to Amy, and we can open it up for questions.
All right, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A box located on your menu bar, or you can use the chat feature. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, here's a list of our upcoming webinars for July. So we just have one left for July, but we have plenty more coming up for the rest of the year. Go ahead and visit our website and you can register for those. If you don't have any questions during this time, but do have one later, you can always reach out to Judy, Patrick, or Scott. Their contact information is here. It's also in the handout that was sent out this morning. Patrick, Scott, Judy, I don't have any questions coming in. Do you have any final thoughts you want to add or comments?
Don't believe so.
I'd just like to echo what Amy had previously said. If there's any other questions that come up over the course of time, and you know, it's for some of you or for a lot of you, I'm guessing it could be a newer topic. So please save our contact information. And if there's any other questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we should be able to get to the bottom of any sort of questions you may have.
Awesome. Well, thank you three for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending, and you have a great day.